I had a really weird feeling just now, so this is a channeled message for somebody out there. If this is a message for you, you'll probably recognize it right away. It's about um, how science intersects with occult and spiritual claims. I am actually maybe coming from a place that a lot of people who might stumble into a video like this could relate to because it's pretty, I'm pretty much a middle aged man, and I only very, very recently had what they would call in this subculture a spiritual awakening. But it, for most of my life, I considered myself an atheist or agnostic, and I've talked about it in maybe some other videos, but I was born into a household that practiced Catholicism, specifically the type of Catholicism that is like Irish and Catholic, Irish and Italian from the Northeast of the United States. And at a certain point, I noticed some things about science and the natural world and physics and some of the spiritual claims that were going on in the Catholic Church, that I just found them to be contradictory. I'm sure this has happened to a lot of people where their understanding of reality through a religious or spiritual framework will clash with a formal education in the sciences, and then sometimes that can extend into other disciplines like that are scientifically based, like Western medicine. And for me personally, it was like psychology and Western philosophy. I sometimes saw a clash in what some of the spiritual claims were in Catholicism. So, if you have a similar story or can see some sort of parallel with your understanding of spirituality, then this channeled message is for you. And I hope that you can get some type of benefit from it. So, sometimes what I'm channeling right now is that sometimes you feel much more strongly aligned with a scientific understanding of reality, and then other times you are leaning very heavily on your spiritual understanding of reality, and you're having trouble accepting that both of those perspectives can be true at the same time. But you know they can, but you're just having trouble squaring some of the details. If you, for example, I'm getting that you understand about nutrition, that there are some claims you see people making about your gut health or your hormonal balance and things like that have to do with diet and nutrition, how the foods you eat and maybe the way you sleep and exercise and all of the things you do with the physical body can change the chemical makeup and the way that your body chemistry works. Not just because of the food you put into it, but the way you use your body can actually hormonally and chemically change you. And you then sometimes can listen to people have a sort of pseudoscientific claim that you can recognize isn't scientifically accurate as far as you understand about the language people are using. You can see a flaw in the scientific claim, but it is pretty common in a lot of subcategories of spiritual communities for people to want to validate their spiritual claims by saying something that seems to justify the spiritual claim with some sort of scientific explanation. And you were put in a situation lately where you would have had the opportunity to prove someone wrong, but because it was over the internet, or because the social opportunity just didn't seem like the right thing to do socially, to speak up about it, you just didn't directly address this. You just didn't want to deal with it, or you just for some reason didn't speak up about this. So now I'm taking a break from the channeled message to tell you my personal opinion about this, is that the physical world is one aspect of reality that is different from the mental aspect of reality and the spiritual aspect. So those are three different realms or planes of existence, and they are overlapping. You are in all three of them simultaneously. They have extremely different rules, and if you only have one point of consciousness, so even though you're in all three of those layers of reality, you can actually zoom in and focus on various experiences and actually have the sensation of not even being aware of the other aspects of reality sometimes. So that's the reason that it's causing a problem for modern spiritual thought, because we live in a secular world where the average person is actually, compared to our ancestors, is very scientifically literate. So we understand science, and it is actually related to its science. Modern science is rooted in alchemy, alchemical thought. It's rooted in the principles of the universe in the same way that Newton's laws of physics are unequivocally true when they describe reality. There are some aspects of reality that have universal laws, like, for example, the law of cause and effect. This is a Kabbalistic law. It is a alchemical law, and it is obviously true when you talk philosophically about time. We understand order of events and we understand cause and effect. Sometimes these are separated as two separate laws, but it's about linear time and the way logically things happen. Whenever something exists, it has an origin, pardon me, and it therefore has a cause and effect. So you can see the effects, and this is a word that I believe is crucial to this channeled message, which is empiricism. Empirical evidence is only rooted in physical reality. You can use your mind to verify and think through why empirical evidence is actually valid and counts as empirical, but it's in the physical world. There's some type of verifiable physical sign that something exists, and that is the evidence that two different minds could look at the same thing. And what if you think about it, those two people have two separate minds. They have no way to prove to the other person that they're having exactly the same experience, but they can both point to something and agree that it is happening. For instance, a change in temperature, we're using some kind of physical device to measure the temperature, and both people can look at the measurement. So the empirical evidence is actually the measurement. Feeling the sensation of heat is technically not empirical evidence because one person might be feeling the sensation of heat differently than the next. So it's not very scientific to simply say, look, this is getting hotter. Even though both people can use their sense of touch to verify it, it's a different form of evidence than to put a thermometer in and say, look, it changed, it made a physical change in another object that we can both verify. That is the only way that that verification would not be valid, is if somehow both people have a completely different perception of a physical proof of something in reality. And I want to point out, empiricism philosophically actually does fall apart because every single aspect of our senses is still being translated somehow into mental information that we think about, and there could always be somehow a flaw in what we are perceiving outside of our minds to be real and physical, but it's a conceptual aspect of reality that we're operating as if it's there as a shared physical reality between us. So empiricism's not perfect, and that is what scientific thought is rooted in. However, when a concept and a scientific claim are aligned, it is scientifically valid. And because it's based on empirical proof, short of doubting the actual physical reality we're in, like this, contemporary thought is actually pretty comfortable doing this sometimes, because it's like, maybe we're in a digital matrix. Maybe this is all a dream and it just appears to be a very concrete physical reality. But short of getting philosophical to that level, in order for our cell phone to function, in order for this circle of salt to be made of salt on a wooden floor, and for us to have those words actually mean specific things, and we can reliably count on the floor to be solid, we can count on the salt to behave certain ways chemically that we can predict. So we're operating as if that is an empirical truth. And because of that discipline being very robust and well developed, we have a shared lexicon when we're talking about science. A lot of words that are rooted in contemporary scientific thought can be co-opted and used in popular spiritualism. And there are so many examples of this, but one of them is quantum physics. People like to use the word quantum and somehow connect it to manifestation and consciousness. And if you are not very well versed in manifestation discourse, it can really turn you off to it. I went through this, and I know so many other people who just simply stop listening to a lot of spiritual claims because they have just a pretty reasonable high school level education of quantum physics, that we all kind of understand the structure of an atom: protons, neutrons, electrons, electron orbits, how molecules are made of atoms bonded to each other through shared electrons or through magnetism, and there are different types of molecular structures. This is a way of discussing reality that we actually can't directly just look at, because you need special tools to verify that physics at the subatomic level is actually provably behaving in a way that our models on a metaphorical chalkboard are proving through mathematics and logic and through experimentation. You can verify indirectly through empirical evidence then being analyzed using logic. And logic and empiricism and the scientific method are actually not as open to interpretation as a lot of spiritual claims. And the reason for this is valid because the spiritual aspect of reality, the spirit realm, actually, I've said this in other videos, can't be described using language the same way the physical world can. And there are even aspects of the mental layer to reality that we can't accurately describe with with language. And language is built to discuss the mental and physical world so that another human being can understand conceptually and relate to what someone is saying using words that are describing the shared world of the physical material world that we share, but also what we assume to be shared experiences because we know that the way our mind works seems to be very similar to how other human minds work. So that is part of how language is very functional to do that. But to discuss an abstract mental concept, and then you start to get into metaphysical concepts, which are like they're referencing a concept that doesn't directly have a physical reference point, but it is talking about something very real, but just doesn't have a literal physical thing you can point to when you discuss it. It's often called metaphysics. And so like you can use language to discuss those things, and you can have words that mean something that is stable within a certain cultural time period so that people understand what each other are saying using human language. And once we develop the written language, well, now you even have the words and the concepts that the words are describing can last for much longer, which stabilize the language. And then you could have a lot more people work on a complex series of like words and definitions, like a bunch of concepts together that you can build off of. And because it is frozen into like a book and can last and be reprinted, and so many people can think about the ideas in that book, you can have a richer, more complex set of ideas that are verifiably true because you're using logic and the scientific method. So the way that we use language in that context is extremely rigid. You need the words to maintain a stable definition in order to pass knowledge between people and have it be trustworthy and accurate. Like it has to have integrity to the words. So this is actually morally wrong to insist that you understand quantum physics and that quantum physics is somehow proving a spiritual claim. It is wrong to do that because it is affecting the integrity of the meaning of the words you're saying, so that future generations have trouble talking about quantum physics in the scientific sense, because there will be all this information put out onto the interweb about quantum physics that is simply not true. And so I'm not trying to insult anyone that is making these spiritual claims, because it's acceptable to me, because there isn't a way to talk about the spiritual world without speaking indirectly. It just, there's an overlap and a reference to the physical world, but it just doesn't have the same rules. The spiritual world doesn't have the same properties as the mental world or the physical world. And because of that, it has different rules. They all have overlapping, some shared rules, but they also each have distinct properties. So, one aspect of the spiritual realm is that it can't be described with language. So, you and I could try to explain our spiritual experience to each other, but language will always fall short. And there has to be, at some point, we have to use faith to just believe that our perception of spiritual reality is somehow accurate. It just, there's no way to verify it. It basically, empirical evidence will never be able to verify a spiritual claim. So when people say that, they really want to explain their idea about that, something that is totally valid, that is a real spiritual experience, and they're doing a good job of explaining it and putting that knowledge into a format that somebody else can at least have a chance of understanding what they're saying. But without a personal, subjective spiritual experience, you really can't get as much out of it. So if I want to explain my spiritual ideas and I decide to use a metaphor of like pouring water from my cup into your cup, everybody knows this is a metaphor. We're not talking about literal cups. And it should be acceptable to talk about quantum physics because there are some people out there who we're assuming understand quantum physics, so that the analogy or metaphor is going to be increasing the chances that this spiritual knowledge can get from one person to another. But there is no way to use language itself on its own to pass that kind of idea. So there's this sort of, when people say that something is pseudoscientific, or they sort of get sidetracked with debating about whether or not quantum physics is being talked about correctly in the spiritual context, you can actually get a lot more and progress faster in your spiritual development if you study quantum physics without trying to connect it to manifestation or God or spiritual claims of any sort. If you just stop trying to connect those two things, and the reason that you have to do that is because the entire understanding of subatomic particles, or even anything microscopic that is too small to be seen with the human eye, that entire way of verifying information requires the scientific method. You have to keep the integrity of science in order to be able to rely on scientific knowledge to build a foundation so that you can understand much more complex scientific concepts that are built off of that. So if you start talking about quantum physics and you actually don't have a very rich and educated understanding of quantum physics, and you just want to sound esoteric and strange and then connect your spiritual idea to it, you might be passing spiritual knowledge successfully to somebody else. And so that it's not necessarily the worst way to pass knowledge back and forth. But if you don't acknowledge that this is a metaphor and that this is an example that you're using to try to get someone to be able to visualize or accept an idea so that they can wrap their head around a similar idea that has some metaphysical properties that are the same, but is not in fact operating on quantum physics. Like, there is nothing about what my understanding about quantum physics is that has anything really to do with manifestation. It's not like, so this this might be interesting to point out, for example, for me to go into examples to explain, and then I will get back to the channeled message. But these two things are intrinsically tied together. So I have to make this point, okay? But just to be more specific with an example, if you have, one aspect of quantum physics is that when there are electrons orbiting the nucleus of an atom and they have certain levels of energy, which involves like the speed that the electron is orbiting, then the electron will now take on a different orbit that expresses itself as sort of like a shell around, that the electron is somewhere in that shell, and it's flying too fast for us to simultaneously measure its speed or the where it specifically is. You either know how fast it's going or you can find where the electron actually is, but it's difficult to get a measurement on both and have them somehow match up because you're using one to measure the other. I don't even know if that is making sense. I do understand technically what's going on, but I don't want to become sidetracked on like trying to painstakingly explain that. But the point is, when the atom absorbs a certain amount of energy, like light or kinetic energy is somehow influencing the atom, the electron can jump to another distance away from the nucleus. And the electron shell doesn't pass through an intermediate point. It just instantly becomes the new distance away. So there can be multiple electrons, and some of them are occupying one distance from the nucleus and some are slightly farther away, and those are essentially like shells. And when the most basic way to explain the idea of quantum, what that word means in this context, is that like there is no explanation for how the electron is getting from one shell to the other, because we have never been able to prove that it passes through some sort of intermediate distance between the two shells. So as far as we know, it stops existing in one shell and at that exact instant starts existing in the further out shell, or vice versa. And so that ability to jump is what quantum jumping is. And other types of particles can do this as well. And so there are certain properties that, if this is true, like it seemed to be true, and keep in mind, we can't see these particles with our eye. So we're using empirical evidence to indirectly verify these things through experiments. And that's the best conception that we have of these subatomic particles. We don't actually have a direct understanding of them. So in fact, another way to look at quantum physics is that we know that it is a flawed, almost incorrect way of describing what is happening, but it's reliably true when you do experiments. So we can't explain why this is happening. And there's always going to be some scientific principles that are like at the limit of our understanding, so that we know something is happening but don't know why, or we don't have all the information yet, so we can't complete the experiment in some ways and find out if something is true. So quantum physics is notorious for having several different aspects that we can somehow verify are real, and the math works out and the experiment seems to point to it being real, but it also doesn't match up with other aspects of physics especially when you're talking about physics at the macro level that we can see with our eyes and we can verify with direct empirical proof. So there's, when people are talking about a unified theory, they're trying to come up with some greater principle of reality that incorporates some of the quantum physics with classical physics. And to because of that, there are several people who are instrumental, like integral scientists who have made groundbreaking work in when it comes to particle physics. And when they were discussing these quantum realities, they were those discoverers themselves were saying that this doesn't logically make sense. There's no way to prove that this is actually what's happening. If you think you understand it, you're incorrect, because this isn't understandable with the human mind. So, and those are people who are in academia, who devoted their lives to studying using the scientific method and discussing with other people where the entire discussion is not acknowledging any sort of non-provable aspect of reality. And that's why quantum physics is noteworthy in that respect. It's noteworthy for a bunch of other reasons, but that's what's so interesting about the double slit experiment or any quantum tunneling, quantum jumping, quantum entanglement. These are things that you can understand as much as you can understand about it, but there's some aspects of it that are just, it's uncanny, that you're like, this is just amazing. There's a mystery there that can't fully be explained. And since there is a large part of any spiritual claim that is, you can subjectively understand it to be true, but it's almost impossible to prove it to somebody else. Like if I had a spiritual experience where I had, like, let's say I astral traveled and left my body. Let's say I had a lucid dream. Somebody else could doubt me, and there is no way that I can ever convince them that experience is valid or really happened to me. They could think I'm losing my mind, or I was just falling asleep and having a dream, and I didn't. It's just a dream about astral travel. It doesn't have any validity as a separate experience from a dream. They just can discount it because it's subjective. And so I recognize that this is like frustrating for people. So they want to find some kind of scientific proof that would prove it is true, the same way that we can prove some things are most likely true about particle physics, despite not being able to just point to the physical object and on its face demonstrate that it's true. You have to do a series of indirect proofs in order to have it be logically proven true. This is not the same as a spiritual claim that you attempt to use logic to prove. It just doesn't hold up under logic and the scientific method. And that's okay. These are different disciplines, and they're actually not contradictory with each other, except for the endeavor to try to prove a spiritual claim with the scientific method. It's like using a tennis racket to play football. Like, it's the incorrect discipline to try to work on something. It's even more incorrect than that. It's like if you and I were gonna play a game, but you showed up with a football and football pads, American football, and you were wearing all of the gear, and we met on a football field, but I showed up with all of the black chess pieces. Like, they're not remotely the same thing. So it's not going to function the same way. So essentially what people use quantum physics to try to make a spiritual claim is often that they're like, um, the observer effect is a great one, where it's like, if you use one method of measuring, there's something about the way that you try to measure certain particles that are behaving as a wave, but also behaving as a particle. And they do apparently one or the other depending on your measuring technique. But there's a flaw in this, because it's clearly the measuring technique itself is an intermediary between observing. There is no way to observe something without using your senses and using some sort of measurement tool when the thing you're measuring is not visible and tangible with the naked eye. You must use some kind of measuring device. So there's clearly something about the way it's being measured that is affecting what the measurement turns out to be. And so the observer effect is real, and it is a good analogy for your perception of a metaphysical problem. Like if you feel insecure, or if you feel like you are very unlucky, or you worked really hard but you have a pessimistic attitude, and so you're just not being compensated with enough money, and you need to change your attitude so that you can perceive the opportunities that you're probably not even aware of, because your perception is trapping you in a certain way of looking at reality. So you have to have a spiritual change, you have to have a psychological change in order to make the change reflected in your physical and mental experiences of the world. So the way you look at something does change the way your decisions go, and it changes the way your future is gonna pan out. If you can change your perspective, you can actually change your fate and the direction you're headed. So it's similar, and it's a good analogy. It's a good metaphor to say that when you observe a particle one way, it actually doesn't behave as a particle, it behaves as a wave. It's a good analogy that it's like changing what you're looking for, and the way you're looking at something can actually change what it is in and of itself. But that's metaphorically similar. There's nothing about manifestation that is like warping the reality around you and changing the literal physical world around you. And there are so many people out there that have made almost like a large part of their spiritual coaching career, like manifestation, YouTube channel career or something like that, out of like a large part of what they talk about is not saying that is a metaphor that they're comparing. Like there are all these other spiritual metaphors, like the ship of Theseus or something like that, but we're not walking around and saying your body is a wooden ship. Like you're not literally saying that's true. You're trying to get the idea from your mind into someone else's mind. But for some reason, because quantum physics is sort of difficult to understand and takes a lot of effort to conceptualize it and keep a hold of it long enough to just be amazed at the mysterious aspects of it, there's something about that just makes people just really, really want their spiritual claim to be one and the same as principles of quantum physics. And it does a disservice to both disciplines. So you should be able to be interdisciplinary, but it's kind of like, I can think of a bunch of other analogies. It's like in neuroscience, we have to use the concept of consciousness, because if you want to study the human brain, you have to say this person is conscious, or they're unconscious, or they have a subconscious. You have to use the concept of consciousness, but it's a notoriously difficult to define word. And then in philosophy, we're talking about consciousness, and it technically is talking about the same thing, but because the discipline is focused on an entirely different perception of that thing. The way you use the concept of consciousness when you're talking about, philosophical existence, like I think, therefore I am, or solipsism, or some aspect of philosophy that requires the examination of the mind, and you're going to talk about consciousness, that's different than when you're clinically talking about brain chemistry and you're like, this patient is unconscious. It's just not totally comparable. You need, so you're using the same word and they are similar concepts, which is why the same word's being used, but it actually has multiple definitions. So you can say that, the principles needed to steer when you steer a skateboard are different than the principles needed when you steer a car. But you can use the word steer, and we understand that it means something that has a definite meaning, but it can reference completely different things that are similar but are not the same thing. And so this is that might seem like an elaborate sidetrack. Like that is like a 20-minute sidetrack, about maybe more, just to establish that point. Now I want to go back to the channeled message. So this is the problem. Being the fact that that's a controversial point to make, you had an opportunity to point something out that was similar. Although what I'm getting is that it wasn't that issue about quantum physics. It was about something more biological than that. It was about parasitic entities and comparing them to something about the human body, I believe. For some people, that's really going to ring true. But it could actually be any scientific claim in order to prove a spiritual belief. So you could see your gut was telling you that these are two different things, and the person was actually making a valid spiritual point and had your full attention and agreement. And then when they started to try to use some kind of pseudoscientific language, you have the scientific education enough to recognize that they just did not know what they were talking about for a little bit of their proof. For instance, earlier in this video, I was struggling to remember, like high school physics when I was describing like the quantum behavior of electrons. Like there's a good chance that I didn't want to be too much more sidetracked, and I certainly didn't want to like start trying to just wing it. So I had to like keep it brief, and I might have left things out, and I would actually, if I really wanted to do it justice, I would have to brush up on that subject. So sometimes people do that, and it's enough that if somebody who just has like a better scientific education than me, I might have had their attention, and then when I started to talk about a literal example about the quantum behavior of electrons, they were like feeling skeptical towards me, and rightly so, right? Because if I don't have the best explanation, then it's like, why am I using that example? So this is a human thing that all of us do. So this is the channeled message, is that you actually were getting a lot out of someone's spiritual advice. They were describing something that was really, the description was either working for you, or they were trying to tell you something that is almost in like parable or moral story, like the moral of a story form, that you were getting something spiritually, that it was moving you, and almost like answering a question that has been nagging you lately, where you felt like you felt excited about what they were saying, and you then suddenly felt a sense of disappointment when they started to make some kind of scientific claim, and even in the moment you let it slide and you didn't say anything about it. This is a key element. And later, when you were by yourself, you wondered if the spiritual advice or claim is valid, because you're seeing a side to this spiritual advisor or friend or whoever they are. Like you're just seeing a side of them where they don't actually have infallible universal knowledge of every aspect of reality. They just had you going and were explaining something that was really rubbing you the right way. But what this channeled message is that their spiritual advice is valid. You need to follow your intuition about what that advice means. And the way to bridge that gap is like listening to someone who seemingly doesn't know what they're talking about for like 30-40% of their statement, but you actually get a lot out of the rest of it. How do you make that make sense? Well, this is what you are already halfway there. So the fact that you bit your tongue and didn't say anything about it, maybe there are times in the past where you spoke up and it caused a sidetrack debate argument where a social rift with someone popped up, and in this case you weren't willing to do that. You didn't want to be the guy arguing in the comment section, or you didn't want to tell your IRL friend they were wrong, and you just let them tell you their spiritual claim despite some of it seeming to be just couldn't possibly be true. You need to allow them to be wrong. Don't go out of your way to try to correct them. And if you are one of the people who otherwise relates to this but did try to correct someone and it maybe didn't go well, or just it's left like you started to but gave up or something like that, that's okay too. This message still applies, but for the vast majority of people, and like who this message is really for, is that there's somebody out there who really, this is like maybe not even usual for them, but in this case they bit their tongue. The spiritual thought that you have in mind when I just pointed that out is real. It's valid. There's a lot to it that you're gonna benefit from. And if you just accept that not everyone has the same understanding of science that you do, and that it is safe for you to explore these spiritual and metaphysical concepts, and you will accomplish the spiritual goals that you currently feel excited about, even if you are exposed to some opinions and advice and perspectives that you couldn't possibly agree with. So you actually need to strengthen that aspect, and that was the purpose of that coming up. That channeled message is for you. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I appreciate anybody who sat through this very long explanation of a relatively brief channeled message. When you boil down to it, it's that there is somebody watching this video right now who was very excited about a spiritual claim, but they found they had to bite their tongue, and after the fact, they wondered if that feeling of wanting to bite their tongue for social reasons was a sign that the entire train of thought was something that is beneath you or not for you or something like that. And the channeled message is no, you're barking up the wrong tree with that. You actually need to go the other direction, and it's a reassurance from your higher self that there's nothing dangerous about this. You're not going to undo your scientific education by studying religion or spirituality or the occult or esoteric knowledge. You actually have discernment and know how to code switch between those two disciplines and all of the subcategories between them. And it's actually it's enriching you and making your brain work harder. You're not losing anything. You're strengthening the way your mind works, and you will ultimately get a deeper understanding of reality from being able to switch between those two disciplines when appropriate. Thank you so much for listening to this channel message on the control entity.